Hi, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Let me introduce myself. My name is Ferra Putri, and so I want to explain psycholanguage learning by myself. A general theory of psycholanguage acoustics needs to account for language acoustics by learned with a variety of characteristics in a variety of contexts. So, in this chapter, we examine some of the theories that have been offered to account for psycholanguage development, progress, and final learning outcomes. As we saw in Chapter 1, behaviorist theory explains learning in the terms of imitation, practice, reinforcement, and habit formation. One, we have psycholanguage application, mimicry, and memorization. The influence was validating the development of video use, language teaching material in the teacher training. Classroom activity explains mimicry and memorization, and students learn dialogues and the sentence parent by heart because language development was viewed as the formation of habit. It was assumed the person learning a second language would start off with the habit formed in the first language and this habit will interfere with the new ones needed for the second language.
In language applications, Krashen's monitor model, perhaps the best-known model of second language acquisition influenced by Chomsky's theory of first language acquisition, is Stephen Krashen's 1982 monitor model. First described in the early 1970s, at a time when there was growing dissatisfaction with language teaching methods based on behaviorism. Krashen described his model in terms of 5 hypotheses. In the acquisition L learning hypothesis, Krashen suggests that we acquire language as we are exposed to samples of language that we understand in much the same way that children pick up their first language with no conscious attention to language form. We learn, on the other hand, through conscious attention to form and rule learning. In Krashen's view, far more language is acquired than learned. Next, according to the monitor hypothesis, second language users draw on what they have acquired when they engage in spontaneous communication. They may use rules and patterns that have been learned as an editor or monitor, allowing them to make minor changes and polish what the acquired system has produced. Such monitoring takes place only when the speaker, writer has plenty of time, is concerned about producing correct language, and has learned the relevant rules. The natural order hypothesis was based on the finding that, as in first language acquisition, second language acquisition unfolds in predictable sequences, as we saw in Chapter 2. The language rules that are easiest to state, and thus to learn, are not necessarily the first to be acquired. The comprehensible input hypothesis is that acquisition occurs when one is exposed to language that is comprehensible and contains I+1. The I representative represents the level of language already acquired, and the +J is a metaphor for language, words, grammatical forms, aspects of pronunciation, that is just a step beyond that level. Krashen's effective filter hypothesis is proposed to account for the fact that SORN people who are exposed to large quantities of comprehensible input do not necessarily acquire language successfully. The effective filter 3, we have second language applications, interacting, noticing, processing, and practicing a number of hypotheses, theories, and models for explaining second language acquisition have been inspired by the cognitive perspective. The interaction hypothesis, Evelyn Hatch, 1978, Michael Long, 1983, 1996, Teresa Pica, 1994, Susan Gass, 1997, and many others have argued that conversational interaction is an essential, if not sufficient, condition for second language acquisition. E-sized push learners ahead in their development. The noticing hypothesis, Richard Schmidt, 1990, 2001, proposed the noticing hypothesis, suggesting that nothing is learned unless it has been noticed. Noticing does not itself result in acquisition, but it is the essential starting point. From this perspective, Comprehensible input does not lead to growth in language knowledge unless the learner becomes aware of a particular language feature. Input processing in his research with American university students. Learning foreign languages. Bilv and Patton, 2004, observed many cases of students misinterpreting sentences. For example, as predicted by the competition model discussed earlier in this chapter. When English speakers heard sentences in Spanish, they used word order to interpret the relationships among the nouns in the sentence. Thus, they interpreted "le sigue el señor" as she, subject pronoun, follows the man. Input processing in his research with American university students learning foreign languages. Bilv and Patton, 2004, observed many cases of students misinterpreting sentences. For example, as predicted by the competition model discussed earlier in this chapter. When English speakers heard sentences in Spanish, they used word order to interpret the relationships among the nouns in the sentence. Thus, they interpreted "le sigue el señor" as she, subject pronoun, follows the man. For last we have second language applications. Learning by talking, extending Vygotskian theory to second language acquisition. Jim Lantolf, 2000, Richard Donato, 1994. And others are interested in showing how second language learners acquire language when they collaborate and interact with other speakers. Traditionally, the ZPD has been understood to involve an expert and a novice. However, recent work has broadened the term to include novice-novice or learner-learner interactions. An example of this is in Communication Task B in Chapter 5, page 137. In that excerpt, the learners are struggling with French reflexive verbs as they try to construct a storyline from pictures. The example is from the work of Meryl Swain and Sharon Lapkin, 2002, who have investigated sociocultural explanations for second language learning in Canadian French immersion programs. Their work has its origins in Swain's comprehensible output hypothesis and the notion that when learners have to produce language, they must pay more attention to how meaning is expressed through language than they ordinarily do for the comprehension of language. Swain, 1985, first proposed Che comprehensible output hypothesis based on the observation that French immersion students were considerably weaker in their spoken and written production than in their reading and listening comprehension. She advocated more opportunities for learners to engage in verbal production, i.e. output, in French immersion classrooms. Since then, she and her colleagues have carried out extensive research to investigate the effects of output on second language learning. Summary: in the end, what all theories of language acquisition are intended to account for is the ability of human learners to acquire language within a variety of social and instructional environments. All of the theories discussed in this chapter and in Chapter 1 use metaphors to represent something that cannot be observed directly. Maybe this is all I can summarize. More and less I apologize and thank you. Roses are red, violets are blue. We have met. Goodbye, boo.